This is Pat Tormey, and today we're going to talk about Smart Client Data Caching in Visual Studio 2005. First thing we need to discuss is caching in general. When is it a good idea? Well, it's a good idea to cache data, either client-side or server-side, whenever the data isn't going to change very often. So you have to actually think about breaking up your data to provide for caching logic. So why would you bother? Well, any data that's already on the client doesn't have to be pushed to them. So that's network traffic, and it's a whole lot of issues that can be avoided just by loading things like combo boxes from a local data set. However, the trouble you can get into is what happens if people are allowed to edit that data. So think about data that's not going to be edited by the client or not edited very often. If you can do that, then it breaks up and you won't get into too much trouble with it. Also, we got to talk about the client side. That's the demo for today. I'm going to show you how to persist the data locally and to persist it securely. Well, maybe not that securely. We're going to look at the where the data is stored, and I'm going to recommend you store any offline caching using the My Documents directory, which you know the user will have permissions for. And there's a technique that we can use to find a file location that'll keep it under the application data. We also want to look at the client side for offline possibilities, so we're going to show you that. The offline possibilities you'll have to give a lot of thought to, but if the person needs to be disconnected and the data is something that's not going to change too often so they won't be in conflict when they reconnect, there's a real opportunity here to connect offline. And of course, speed is a big issue. If you can cache data locally, it's going to load faster just because it's on the local hard disk than if it has to come across the wire. Now, server-side caching, we'll look into that in the future, but server-side from a web service is caching just like any other web page can be cached. And this is some very interesting opportunities because while it still goes back to the database, it still goes back to the website, it doesn't necessarily have to go back to the database. And one of my favorite ideas, which is not in this session but will be in this one coming up soon, is to use SQL dependency cache. This is something that I think has a strong future for it, and we'll get looking into it. So, let's go ahead and begin. This is Pat Tormey. Let's see how this application will look. Okay, let's have a look at our little application here. Smart Client application with a customer's orders, order detail, and a little thing to get the customer first letter for a quick lookup. I've added a data status table, which keeps track of whether the status is okay, a message, just as plain text, and then when the system was last updated. So every time I fetch the data set, it knows these things on its return trip. I do this specifically to avoid having to pass a SOAP message to the end user. Okay, so I can dimension a bunch of data set adapters and fill them up. And then I add the status row, true if it succeeds, false if it doesn't, and flag the now universal time to the row updated. This way I can tell how stale the data is at any given time. It becomes useful when you go to data caching. So I have a client, I have the data set, and a web service. The web service calls the data set and does a simple update using a data access layer, or it returns the data set. Notice here I'm not returning any errors or handling any exceptions. They're all handled at the data access layer. My project references the Northwind dataset. And let's take a look at how that runs. If you click on any of the letters, this goes after that first letter and finds whatever company name you're looking for. I can type in B' to get B's Beverages, return to all, navigate through the grid of the parent, which is the company, or the orders, and you can see everything stays in sync. I can drag and drop my toolbar from one side to the next. No reason, that's just kind of fun to do. And I can navigate through the records, and the binding adapters keep everything in sync for me. First thing I need to do is make a safe place to store the data. So I'm declaring a variable here called the local file, and specifically listing the special directories of the current user data application and calling it data.xml. This is important because I need to store it someplace that the user has rights to. And this, amazingly, is all it takes to actually write the XML to the local file from an existing data set. Pretty easy, huh? Okay, when I save the data, in this case I just say save local data, and I'm going to run it every time that the application saves, although it isn't necessary. I could write it whenever it actually changes the data. As you can see, it just calls back and says write that out. I'm also using a checkbox that I'm assigning to a settings for use cache. We'll go to Solution Explorer and see how that works. By having a setting called use cache set true, it's strongly typed, so I know it's a Boolean, and I set the cache minutes. Both of these are user variables. Okay, so that tells me what the setting has to be if the checkbox has changed. Now I'm going to load the web service. I simply go get a fresh web service, clear the data set, and assign it back, ready to go. Now I also want to be able to load from a cache if I need to. The important thing here is to first find out if the cache exists. So I look for the file info for the local file name. And I set the cache for how many minutes I think the cache will be safe. And you need to think about that, so that's why I drove it from a settings variable. Now when the form loads, I just use a checkbox and mark it according to what the user cache currently is. And if it can load the data locally, it does. And if it can't, it loads it through the data service. Okay, let's see what we get when we step through. Okay, in this case the cache is false, so I'll just go ahead and load the data. And load service data just gets it from my web service, and I load the data set up. Okay, so far nothing tricky. Now, flipping the cache, I'd run it again, leaving my breakpoint set so I can see what happens when it discovers the cache set to true. Cache is true this time. And in this case, you can see the file info reports that it's true, and it's within 60 minutes of the last time I wrote to the cache. And again, the same routine. I load the data file. It succeeded. I load the local data set and update my company tool strip, and there you have it. And everything stays in sync. This time I'm running entirely from the cache. So let's take a look at how the magic all happened. We'll take a look at the XML file itself. Here we have it. You notice it's listed underneath my Northwind client app in the version number that I selected. And there's my data file. It's 922 kilobytes, and it's just straight XML. Now remember, this is plain text, but it's being stored by that user under that user name, My Documents. So it's relatively secure, but it might be a good idea to encrypt it depending on the nature of your data. And this is Pat Tormey, and this has been data caching on the client side for smart clients.